He has all the virtues I dislike, and none of the vices I admire. Thus spoke Winston Churchill of his arch-nemesis from World War II. And what a classy way that was to give someone he despised his due, wouldn't you agree? And that, dear viewers, is exactly what I'm going to try to do today. But let's do a little hopscotch this time and start the story by its end. Other considerations and final thoughts. I didn't like Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous. As a matter of fact, I very strongly disliked it at times. But you know, when you've had a long-lasting relationship with someone, it would be unbecoming to simply end it by ghosting the other person, wouldn't you agree? And since my relationship with Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous lasted longer than most other relationships I've been in, I thought I'd write a breakup note. I am a level-headed, mature, and sophisticated gentleman after all.
Bullshit.
So here goes my mature, sophisticated, and original farewell.
It's not you. It's me.
You're giving me the it's not you, it's me routine? I invented it's not you, it's me. Nobody tells me it's them, not me. If it's anybody, it's me.
All right. It's you.
You're damn right it's me.
Nah, it's me. I just belong to a different time. My references are just different from yours. They are old and outdated. Some would say even medieval. My idea of what is entertaining and rewarding, the things that I am willing to forgive and the ones that I can't stop praising, are all things of the past. You are young and fresh and full of life. I am just an old man whose best years are behind him. You deserve better. But still your heart, for I know that there's a world of TikTok users, young people out there who would kill to be with someone like you. And like I've said before, the time I spent with Tainted Grail Conquest was just a short-lived romance. It didn't mean anything.
Are you coming home?
Shh! I'm trying to write a note here, Tainted. I'll be with you in a minute. I gotta go now, Pathfindy. But know that I'll always remember the long, extended, persistent, elongated, lengthened time we spent together. I'm sure that a few years from now, I'll be able to revisit the times we spent together and smile at the few lovely memories we've shared. I know there'll be a time in which we will be able to forgive ourselves for the terrible pain we inflicted on each other, especially you on me. But that time is not now. Now is time for a video. Welcome to Ye Olde Entertainment. My name is Alex, and as you know, it is my duty, my mission, my purpose in life to help you decide whether that game that you have been thumping for so long is indeed the right game for you or not. And today, we have Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous, the second entry in the Pathfinder saga. A series that's been praised by many fans of the tabletop original, quite a few newcomers to the genre, good luck with that noobs, and even a few old-timers who just can't get enough of timeless classics like the Baldur's Gate and Icewind Dale series. Oh, but in the darkest confines of the world, there also live those who dissent, those who see Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous as the herald of the all-consuming nothingness that rapidly encroaches on the world of video games. Of entertainment even. And I think those people deserve to have a voice, don't you think?
What about me?
I hear you say. What if I don't care about who says what? What if I just want to know if the damn game is for me or not? Well, then you've come to the right place. Mostly. As you know, I rate games according to a system of categories that I think is relevant to the genre of the game at hand. And today, that game is Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous, a classic RPG that takes place in a medieval fantasy setting, and uses Paizo Publishing's Pathfinder ruleset, which is, in turn, a spin on D&D's 3.5 edition ruleset. And if that sounds like too much to take in, then get used to it, because that's the Pathfinder way. Where I come from, we have a saying. When something is more than it needs to be, we say, that's a lot with too much. And character creation and character progression is just the first thing in Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous of which I can say that. When I first played Wrath of the Righteous's predecessor, Pathfinder Kingmaker, I was amazed at the sheer number of options that appeared before me at the character creation screen. It was like when I went to the FAO Schwartz toy store for the first time when I was a kid. Holy shit, this is a dream come true, I thought. But once my initial impression died out, and as I started walking about the aisles of the store and looking at the actual toys on the shelves, I started to get progressively disappointed. Yeah, there were many familiar toys there, some of which were, in theory, my kind of toys. But in the building toy section, where I expected to find a box of the awesome Asco plastic building set, I found a box of the more sophisticated Meccano. Where I expected to find the set of Capsella that I had been dreaming about getting for months, there was a box of IQ Key. When my mother saw the disappointment in my face, she declared excitedly, "Those are the new versions of the toys you like." I was only 10 at the time, but I had never felt older than that day.
Let's go, Mommy. I don't like this store,
I said. That day, I still left the store with a set of the Meccano Erector.
Look, it's called Erector and it's blue, just like that pill you...
Anyway, this ASCO building toy I'm telling you about was awesome. Its pieces and bolts and screws were as big and as easy to manipulate as your average body positivity activist. But with it you could build whatever you wished, however you wished. But what I found most enjoyable about it was that all throughout the building process it was easy to envision the final toy, whether it was a giraffe or a car. And you could tell exactly what each piece, bolt, and screw that you were using to build your toy was going to do for your creation at any given moment during the building process. The Meccano Erector was quite another story. The car you were meant to build with this set was more sophisticated, and it definitely looked cooler and way more realistic, but it was also a heck of a lot more complicated to build. It had hundreds of pieces, and it shipped with an entire bag of screws and bolts of various kinds. Building a car with the ASCO building set only required you to look at the reference picture once or twice. You could even wing it and let your creativity loose at any given time. And if you knew what you were going for and had a modicum of common sense, it was hard to fuck things up. Building your car with a Meccano Erector set required you to use each of its hundreds of pieces exactly as they were meant to. You had to pay close attention to every tiny little piece, every bolt, every screw. Fucking things up could be as easy as using a long bolt in a joint that required a short one. The manual was thorough and detailed, and a pain in the ass to read. There was no winging it with the Meccano Erector. The chance that your car ended up looking like the one in the picture was about the same as the chance you have of getting a burger at McDonald's that looks like the one in the ad. Pathfinder Kingmaker was like that Meccano Erector, except for the fact that, with the Meccano, if you had the time and patience to follow the instructions on the manual, you could actually get a decent result. And just as it happened with the Meccano Erector, it took me 4 attempts before I finally rolled a monk that didn't absolutely suck in Pathfinder Kingmaker. A monk that even grew to become overpowered at some point during the game. And yeah, it was partially my fault, because I decided to roll a monk that one time. A class with which I had no prior experience in a game that is notoriously difficult and known for being unforgiving to newcomers.
Fuck me, right?
Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous has a very similar character creation screen. It has recommended builds that you can use out of the box, and it seems to have more detailed explanations about everything than its predecessor. And some of them would have come in handy in Pathfinder Kingmaker, I'll admit, but explanations are just well-dressed mistakes, Julio Cortázar used to say, and I think this game embodies this like few others. Allow me to elaborate further. Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous features 25 classes. 25! And if that's not enough for you, every time you level you can choose to go for an additional class if you so wish to. So there are endless possibilities for multi-classing. Also, these classes have archetypes. This time I learned my lesson and rolled a Paladin. The Paladin, for example, had 7 different archetypes. And since my plan was to become the party's tank, and because I know how to read, the Stone Lord archetype seems like a fairly obvious choice. Then there's 12 races for you to choose from. And of course, they all have heritages. The Aasimar, for example, have 7 different heritages, and these heritages come packed with their own bonuses and penalties. Also, as you are creating your character, you get the chance to allocate some attribute points. You can also choose a background which adds further bonuses and penalties to skills, and interestingly, offers the possibility to choose some weapon proficiencies. You can also allocate points to different skills. The game points out the ones you'd be getting the most out of given your previous decisions during your character creation process. And depending on your class and archetype, you'll get an additional perk. If you're a monk, for example, you'll get an additional monk feat. If you're a wizard, you'll get to choose some spells, and if you're an oracle, you'll get to choose a mystery, and so on and so forth. And to round things up, you can choose lots of other shit like your alignment, the deity you want to worship, your birth date, and of course, your portrait and your physical traits. And as it happens with regular D&D games, every class has a leveling roadmap, so to speak. Only this one factors in your archetype, and even your deity of choice. You don't get points to spend on attributes and spells every time you level. You get what you're meant to get depending on your class. Sometimes it's a choice of feat, sometimes it's an additional attribute point, sometimes it's a fixed skill or an additional use for a skill you already know. I'm not a fan of this, and I never will be. but I know this is the D&D/Pathfinder way of things, so I knew what I was getting into, and so should you. Well, at least in this game you get to see your class's roadmap from the get-go. I wish every D&D game had this. Throughout the game you'll encounter story-related situations that will give you the chance to choose some mythical paths. There's actually 10 of them, no less. Some of them become available very late in the game, and they depend on some of your story-related decisions. These mythical paths have their own roadmaps, which is independent from your class's roadmap. Each of them comes with their own assortment of eligible mythical skills and feats, and they also, quote, have an impact on how the story goes. We'll get to those quotes later though. One issue that I have with these mythical skills and feats is that at some point they become overpowered compared to your class, and that means that your class will become progressively less relevant as you progress through the game. But this doesn't sound too terrible now, does it? The problem that I find with character creation and character progression in Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous is that, as it happened with the Meccano Erector, it's not always clear what the best options are to build your character and to hone its skills so that it efficiently plays the roles you want it to play in your party. Let's say that you want to build a Tanky Paladin. Well, tanks are all about generating threat and mitigating damage, right? Their purpose is to funnel all incoming damage onto themselves, and they thrive on being able to withstand said damage. But which are the best feats to achieve this? In Pathfinder, this is not an easy question to answer. Quite the contrary, it's actually very easy to get your build wrong, because of the endless number of statuses, buffs, debuffs, the fact that some types of damage are negated or mitigated by fortitude, others by reflex, and others by will, and because some spells and effects can only be partially negated and still apply some sort of negative effect even if you pass the check for the applicable saving throw. There are many situations in which your tank will simply not be the right person for the job. Unless of course you inspect the enemies, take note of the spells and talents they are capable of, know exactly what these spells do and the buffs that will protect you from them. But kicking about the internet for a couple of minutes will make it abundantly clear that there's a fair bit of confusion about which spell and effect does what. Take this thread for example, about whether or not protection from evil would protect you from fear. Spoiler alert, it doesn't. But this is what this user said. Does protection from evil protect against the fear spell? Note that protection from evil is written a little differently in Pathfinder than in D&D. The fear spell is necromancy, fear, mind affecting, blah 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 blah. And there are two different answers citing the school of magic to which fear belongs to and the descriptors on each spell. And worst of all, these answers contradict each other. They're citing of other resources, footnotes. Are you shitting me? At the end of the day, this all amounts to a game of rock, paper, scissors multiplied by 100 that adds 0 tactical depth to the combat.
But Alex, you whiny little bitch.
Wait, random voice that sometimes comes up to bust my balls. Whose side are you on?
If you think this is much too complicated, there are different difficulties available, including a video game journalist mode, including a story mode that is basically a non-challenge, so you can adjust the level of difficulty to the one that suits you best.
Well, idiotic strawman with a funny voice who keeps missing the point completely. You know what else has varying degrees of difficulty? Chess. Chess is a game in which you move pieces across a board. There are 6 different types of chess pieces. Each side starts with 16 pieces, 8 pawns, 2 bishops, 2 knights, 2 rooks, 1 queen, and 1 king. It takes place in an 8x8 square grid. It's turn-based, and you can move 1 piece per turn. That's it. That's all there is to it. And this is what the scroll bar looks like on the page that explains in detail how the entire game works, even with all its big pictures. While this tiny thing here is the scroll bar in the page that merely lists the spells available in Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous.
Ain't nobody got time for that. Ain't nobody got time for that. Ain't nobody got time. Ain't nobody got time. Ain't nobody got time for that. Ain't nobody got time for that. Ain't nobody got time for that. Ain't nobody got time. Ain't nobody got time. Ain't nobody got time for that.
I promise you, dear viewer, that all it takes is a couple of hours to get to know the rules of chess every bit as well as Viznawana, as well as this Indian fucker. But I can also promise you that he would rip you a new arsehole in a matter of minutes if you ever got the chance to play against him. So maybe you wanted to start with the drunkard enthusiasts at the local plaza before you take on someone better. A game that seeks to challenge your tactical skills should be easy to learn and hard to master. I guess my point is that I don't want to bang my head against the wall trying to figure out how to turn my paladin into a competent tank for all situations. That should be cut and dry. It should be flexible enough for you to implement your personal brand of tanking, so to speak, but it should also be a straightforward process nonetheless. I'd like the challenge to come from the AI making it difficult for my paladin to perform its tanking duties. In Icewind Dale 2, for example, the game threw curveballs at you constantly. In this dungeon, it spawned monsters on your rear guard. That forced you to make a bit of an ad hoc SWOT analysis of your party for the given situation in order to overcome the challenge. If you had another character with decent resilience, you could have it tank the monsters on your rear guard to keep your DPS clothies safe while they took care of business. There was also a third path you could retreat into to hole up there, funneling all the monsters into a tiny space, putting your tank into a position that allowed it to do its job comfortably. There was this other part in which the enemies banged on drums to summon reinforcements. In some cases, the drums were pretty far back along a narrow corridor that made it difficult for your party to reach them. There were many ways to address this, but if you had a druid like I did, you could summon a pet right next to the drum to destroy it without even triggering the fight. The moral of the story here is that difficulty should come from your opponent's capacity to make smart tactical decisions, like your enemy's AI in video games, and not from the complexity of the game's rules. And you're probably thinking, man, this guy must have sucked at this game. Or if you're less of an arrogant asshole, you're probably thinking, man, I am going to suck at this game. And neither of those things is necessarily true. Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous at the end of the day is like driving a car. And what I mean by this is that we all know how to do it. But this particular car, instead of your standard fare car dashboard, uses a 747 cockpit, at least as far as character creation goes. The complication of the system far exceeds the actual complexity of the game. Believe it or not, playing in core difficulty, I felt like 70% of the combat in Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous could pretty much be dealt with through some variation of the good old tank and spank method. Some fights required you to twist the tank and spank formula a little, but it did not demand any great tactical thinking. True, the 140 hours of Pathfinder that I played before, and my 3 failed attempts before I could successfully create a decent character in that game, might have given me the experience to build a more efficient character this time, thus helping me cut through Wrath of the Righteous by mostly tanking and spanking. What I mean by this is that I don't think that the game is all that difficult. I just wonder, I will say this, at some point in the game when I leveled, I got a horse, and it was fucking awesome. He also saved my ass like 40% of the times. So this is one thing that I can genuinely say I loved about my character and its skills. I named my horse Suck My Cock. It's Orcish, I swear.
You speak Orcish?
Why yes, Sil, yes I do. And I also speak Dorkish. And that's why this channel might just be the thing you need. So do consider subscribing if you like what you're seeing. And because I speak Orcish, I know that Suck My Cock is Orcish for strength and honor. It's a popular greet in Orcish lands. When you meet an orc, you say Suck My Cock, and he responds in kind. Anyway, my frustrations with character creation and character progression don't end with combat, unfortunately. There's also questing in this game, and a story to follow, and I always expect my choices of race and class to matter at least somewhat. I chose to be a dwarf. The game didn't give a shit. In more than 180 hours of gameplay, there were only 2 times in which this was ever acknowledged. In Dragon Age Origins, for example, playing a dwarf or an elf doesn't only mean that you get a completely unique first act that has its own story, location, and characters, but also, throughout the game, people react to you in certain ways because of your race. This guy in Lothering believes you are a merchant because you are a dwarf, and every dwarf he's ever met before has been a merchant. This bandit here finds it curious that the leader of the party he intends to extort for protection money is a dwarf.
Wake up, gentlemen. More travelers to attend to. Led by a dwarf, oddly enough.
This kid asks you if you are greedy, because his dad says dwarves are greedy.
Father says dwarves are really greedy, but you're not greedy at all.
When Alistair talks about the need to go back to Ozamar at some point, this conversation takes place.
You'll be there under Grey Warden business, and the dwarves will just have to see reason.
They certainly are renowned for an abundance of reason, 'tis true.
In Wrath of the Righteous, I also chose to be a paladin, and the game didn't give a shit. In Pillars of Eternity, for example, there are even some neat little dialogue options and possibilities that you have plot-wise because you're a paladin with the let's say, Shield Bearer of St. Helga archetype. In these other games, I felt like the choices I made at the character creation screen mattered beyond just its combat-related possibilities. This wasn't the case with Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous, or at least not enough. And what about magic? One would think that having magical talents would come in handy to take care of some non-combat related situations, right?
Wrong.
Pathfinder doesn't think so. What about stealing and its consequences?
There aren't any!
In Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous, I felt like the game was all hell-bent on throwing everything it had to offer at me, but it didn't care enough about my decisions. Even with the supposedly branching paths mythical paths had to offer, of which we will be talking about later, I never felt like I was truly navigating the story my way. Character creation in Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous is not bad by any means, it's just a lot with too much. And enemy AI in most combat challenges just never justified the sheer complication of its system. I also think it fell short as means to navigate the story. Gameplay. Medieval fantasy CRPGs generally revolve around combat, questing, exploration, and sometimes puzzle solving. Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous has combat, questing, exploration, puzzle solving, scripted skill check events, stronghold management, army management, tactical army combat, the kitchen sink, and yo mama. And that wouldn't have been a problem if it had all worked as a cohesive whole. But sadly, I don't think this is the case most of the times in Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous. Imagine there's this park that has a slide, and imagine that right at the end of the slide, there's a slight terrain inclination. And at the end of it, there's a wheel. And now imagine that kids use the slight inclination after they use the slide to gain momentum, to jump at the wheel and give it a spin. It's fun, seamless, and because of that little terrain inclination, 95% of the kids use the wheel right after they use the slide. And because of that, kids prefer this playground to other playgrounds in the neighborhood. Get the picture? Now imagine there's this playground building company. They've taken note of the old park's popularity, and of the fact that most of the kids who use the slide also use the wheel. But although these new park builders have determined that 95% of the kids who use the slide also use the wheel, have failed to understand that it is because there's a slight inclination between these two games. So these park builders built their own new playground that's going to be bigger and cooler, and it's going to have every cool thing there's ever been in every playground before, including a slide and a wheel that kids are going to use together. So in order to make kids use the slide and the wheel in tandem in their park too, these new park builders have hired a guy to stand at the stairs of the slide. And when a kid who's already used the slide tries to use it immediately again, the guy stops him and says, "Hey kid, have you tried the wheel yet?" And the kid is like, "Nah, I haven't." So the guy is like, "Oh, you should give it a try, kid. The wheel is also fun." So the kid looks at the wheel and, unconvinced of its entertainment potential, says, "Nah, I'm more like a slide kid, you know. I've never been too much into wheels." So the guy says, "Try the wheel, kid." The kid, undeterred and still unimpressed, says, "I'm going to use the slide if you don't mind, sir." So the guy says, "Listen here, you little shit, you are going to use the wheel, whether you like it or not, or otherwise, I'm not letting you ride the slide again." So the kid goes to the wheel, spends some time on it under the guy's watchful eye, and then he goes to his mom and says,
Let's go, Mommy. I don't like this park.
So Thronebreaker The Witcher Tales is a Gwent-based Witcher spin-off that has card-based combat as its core gameplay element. It's an RPG in essence, and it has exploration, puzzle solving, combat, lots of decision making, and stronghold management. Thronebreaker works exactly like the first park in our little children's playground story. Because the marrow of the game is deck building, everything else in the game revolves around it. So you look at your deck and its possibilities and think about how you want to build it. That of course means choosing cards that work well for your strategy. You can build different facilities for your camp, and these facilities allow you to create cards of certain types. You of course are going to want to focus on those facilities that allow you to create the cards that you need. But in order to build these facilities, you need different resources, and you can buy those while you're out there exploring the world and battling Nilfgaardians, Scoia'tael, and even monsters. Sometimes you'll have to pay for these resources, but most of the time, there's some sort of opportunity cost involved. Do I ask my men to risk their necks to get these planks of wood, thus incurring in a loss of morale for my troops? Do I use some of those resources to help a community at the cost of delaying the construction of a facility, in the hope that their gratitude will outweigh the cost? The same applies to the story. Your decisions in Thronebreaker have an impact on how the story unfolds, but also on your deck, and there are some pretty heavy moral decisions to be made in Thronebreaker. The game often throws wartime dilemmas at you, in which you will often have to choose between doing what's right and doing what's most useful for your war efforts. The result is that you just can't get enough of any of it. Everything works in beautiful harmony. Pathfinder is a bit like the second park. The first time you're introduced to army management or stronghold management in Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous, there isn't much tying any of it to your little band of adventurers. Yes, there are story reasons to engage in both of these things, but at best, they feel like things you do to take a break from your adventure. And at worst, they feel like chores. There are locations that you have to go to because they are part of the critical path you are meant to follow, that you won't be able to access because they are locked behind the demon strongholds that you can only conquer by sending your army. So this stronghold is like that guy who won't let that kid play with the slide again. You can put this off until later, but sooner or later you'll have to put together an army and take care of business. The thing is that most of these demons' strongholds are very high level because the game wants you to engage in army combat, recruiting, stronghold management, and all these other stuff you need to do in order to build a decent enough army. The game's idea of integration then is to add roadblocks to your adventurer's critical path and force you to engage in these other aspects of the gameplay that you probably wouldn't give two shits about if they weren't mandatory. Yes, there are some very cool items that your army can retrieve in some battles that can later be turned into something awesome if you start the corresponding research project, but it doesn't feel like something over which you have control, something that you can use to further equip your party the way you'd like. Crusade Management is equally tedious, and the game also shoots itself in the foot with it. There was this particularly tough dungeon that I couldn't do all at once, and that required me to go back to my stronghold, take a rest, sell some stuff, restock, etc. But as soon as I entered the Citadel, like many oh so many times before, I was interrupted with an automated Crusade Council meeting that required my attention, and it was implied that I had to stop doing what I was doing to go somewhere else. So after some bullshit conversation that I couldn't have cared less about at the time, I finally took a rest, sold all the shit I had collected, and bought new potions and scrolls, and set forth to the pesky dungeon once again. And again, I was interrupted and asked to do something else, something very extremely important. Oh, fuck off, game already. I just want to finish the stupid Blackwater dungeon once and for all. See, in Baldur's Gate 2, there are a lot of things that require your immediate attention, so to speak. Some stuff that you can't delay doing for too long, like that quest in which you have to get to the bottom of Jaheira's curse because she's progressively losing vitality and stats and may even eventually die if you don't help her. But none of it is randomly imposed. Baldur's Gate 2 is cleverly designed in this respect. If at some point you're all hell-bent on seeing the end of a questline or clearing a location, nothing will force you out of that plan. While you will be able to pick up new quests and missions while you're committed to clearing a location, none of them will be introduced in a way that's disruptive of your adventuring agenda. And Pathfinder would have mostly been like that if it hadn't been for the management elements of the game. But we have talked enough about how all these aspects of the gameplay trip over each other rather than add to a fun and exciting experience. What about each individual aspect of the gameplay? Are they any good? Well, let's start with combat, as this is clearly meant to be the main aspect of the game. I'd say that 75% of the combat in Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous can be taken care of, like I said, by means of the good old tank and spank formula. Pretty standard stuff, really. Sneaking in gets you crits, sending your tanks first prevents the rest of your party from getting damaged, etc. There are some mandatory buffs that you should always have, like haste and heroism, and you can round up things with bless and prayer, and that's it, that's all there is to it. The problem with this is that there are way too many encounters that are resolved in the exact same way. The enemy AI is subpar most of the time, and that means that combat can and will get old at times. Some encounters require you to throw in additional firepower, but even in those, the additional difficulty comes from enemies being bullet spongy, rather than from the AI doing anything clever or unexpected. If you have been following along, you know that I am not a huge fan of Neverwinter Nights 2's core campaign. But one thing that game absolutely nailed was the pacing. The game went on for more than 70 hours and it was never boring. Just as soon as you started to get tired of a dungeon, boom, it was over, and off you went to do the next thing. But that's not the case with Pathfinder, and therein lies the problem. Almost every location in Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous outstays its welcome. If Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous had been half as long, and if they had kept all the cool encounters, of which there are a few, combat would have been so much better. But then there's 15% of the time in which the game truly fires on all cylinders, and when it does, it's fucking awesome. I suppose that if you're a seasoned Pathfinder veteran and know all the ins and outs of every spell and effect, you're going to breeze through all these combat situations. But if you are not, then you can still come out victorious if you switch your tactical mindset back on, using certain skills in a certain order, kiting, or using the level layout to your advantage. But compared to the many unnecessary cut and paste encounters, they were too few and too far in between. War Marine had this to say in the comment section. I hold off for a long time on Icewind Dale 2 as I heard about its high difficulty, but I was surprised how much I liked it when I played it. Difficulty felt fair and tactically challenging, rather than checking my knowledge on D&D buffs and debuffs. Well, you should know that there's combat situations in Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous that are nothing but an exam, filled with trick questions about the many spells, effects, buffs, and debuffs in the game. I know that many of you think of these types of encounters as tactical, but when the discussions that you see around the internet about how to beat these encounters boil down to the immunities that you have to overcome and the protections that you need against incoming enemy impairing effects, you know that these fights will go from impossible to a non-challenge if you use the right spell. And that right there is my definition of a bullshit fight. And there are quite a few of those here, like this idiotic crystals, especially this one. TC had this to say in the comments section. And by the way, go check that comment out, because it's probably a better review of the game than this entire video. I'll leave a link to it in the description section down below. These are 4 of the things that TC mentioned as problematic about combat in Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous. Poor combat AI scripting. Enemies tend to rigidly do the same few programmed steps again and again, often to the detriment of themselves, even with casters and additional AI features turned on. You won't get many fights with the complexity and play-counterplay akin to even the spell duels you have in Baldur's Gate 2. He also said, lots of lazy encounter design. There are some really good fights in Wrath of the Righteous, but there are a lot more copy and paste fights in samey, cramped locations that lead to a lot of repetitiveness, the worst being the spawn the same group again fights. The enemy variety feels lacking because of how long the game is and how many fights there are. I know attrition is supposed to be a part of the D&D Pathfinder challenge, but mythic abilities and abundant resting locations handwave that challenge even on the highest difficulties. Combat in Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous can be either real-time with pause or turn-based, and they both work exactly the way you'd expect. But while you can pretty much choose your preferred approach and stick to it throughout the entire game, these approaches aren't necessarily equally efficient for all encounters. Some combat encounters require careful timing or properly calculating the range of a spell so that you can place your party members outside the area of effect of an incoming enemy spell, or within the range of a beneficial effect. For these encounters, the turn-based approach is clearly better, but some other encounters have you fighting hordes upon hordes of enemies, and I probably don't need to tell you how that's going to turn out if you go for the turn-based approach for these situations. I can understand why some people see the ability to change the combat system on the fly as a feature of flexibility, but when some combats are easier or harder depending on the system you use, then I see it as an inconsistency, and I am not particularly crazy about it. TC also had this to say, this time about the story. The gameplay side also drags out the story, adding a lot of more or again, and well, we are going to see what that is about later. And while more and again seem to be the trademarks of Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous in many respects, in no aspect of the gameplay is this truer than in puzzle solving. If there is one good thing that I can say about puzzle solving in Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous, is that it is not mandatory to progress in the game's critical path. And thank the maker for that, because puzzles in Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous are the lowest of the low. We're talking, move these tiles in the correct order to open this door low. Not only are these types of puzzles tedious to begin with as a concept, but they are also hideously implemented here. Let's talk about a series of puzzles that you have to solve for a quest called The Secrets of Creation, as it epitomizes everything that's wrong with puzzles in this game. These are some of the issues that I had with them. First, these puzzles are about matching icons, and these icons are much too busy graphically, and once you got them in your inventory, they are a pain to tell apart. Second, there are 2 clickable areas per socket, and just putting the tile in the orientation you want, in the socket you want, is in itself a challenge. And that's bad. Really bad. Third, trial and error iterations are much too long. In games like Myst, and this is the paragon of puzzle games by the way, once you figure out how the puzzle works, and once you establish the things that you want to try out to solve it, each attempt takes seconds, not minutes. A good puzzle is one that takes time to figure out, but very little to try out. But because these puzzles are dumbed down to put tiles in the correct order, then the way to make them difficult is to make every trial sequence a long pain in the ass, in which you have to put all the tiles before you know it didn't work. Fuck off, game. Fourth, there's not 1, not 2, not 3, but 6. 6 of these tile placing puzzles. I got through 5 of them, only to find out that there was yet another one. And this is just one series of puzzles, but yes, tile placement and pressing tiles in the correct order is pretty much the name of the game in the puzzle department. And I hated almost every minute of it. And I say almost because this one was cool. Let's talk about Stronghold and Crusade Management.
Am I the only one around here
who actually liked the Stronghold management better in Kingmaker? I may be the only one here, but the concept of appointing counselors for different areas and the likelihood of success of your initiatives depending on your counselor's aptitude was actually a pretty cool thing to deal with. I especially enjoyed having Amiri as a counselor, only to never do as she recommended until she quitted. Yes, there were timed events and they were a monumental pain in the ass, but as a gameplay mechanic, at least, well, it was a gameplay mechanic. In Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous, this is dumbed down to an endless parade of petitioners and letters telling you about this or that problem and the choices that would grant you X amount of leadership, or Y item, or Z type of recruitable unit. And I'm not one to skip dialogue or even codex entries, but with this missives and hearings, I found myself just skipping to the part in which they told me what I would get from each choice and clicking on the one I liked the best. Every once in a while, these decisions will lead to the acquisition of some recruitable units for your armies. I'm sure this was introduced as a way to integrate Crusade management to army management. The problem with this is that most of the units that you acquire this way are a one and done deal, meaning that there's only one group of them, and your armies can have a limited amount of unit types, and they can only get strong enough to be able to face the strongest demon armies by increasing the numbers of units in their ranks. I think you can see the problem with this. So, while some of these unit types seemed pretty awesome, I always ended up recruiting the ones that replenished at the end of the week. I enjoyed combat encounters with my armies for the most part, having a certain general, or using this or that unit, as well as unlocking certain army perks, had a significant impact on how the battles developed. And although the rules for these combat situations were simple, there was still some room for strategy and tactics. Recruiting units and moving your army about was a pain though, and there were some shockingly bad user experience issues with it. Sometimes generals were not eligible because they were on cooldown. If you recruit units at your stronghold and you don't already have an army there, it will create a new army that you will then have to move to wherever your target army is. And none of these things are very well explained in my opinion. There are also a few skill check scripted events in Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous, and I almost thought there weren't going to be any. This facet of the game was introduced rather early in Pathfinder Kingmaker, but in Wrath of the Righteous it takes a sweet little time to make an appearance. Some of these skill check scenarios are decent, one of them is even awesome. Your second encounter with the Dragon Devara is locked behind a series of scripted skill check events that is uncharacteristically well written. This brought back memories from some of the best choose-your-own-adventure D&D books. There's also another very cool sequence at the end of the act that takes place in Illusionera. Still, I think this was underutilized in Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous. In Pillars of Eternity, you choose the companion with the best skill, and what follows is a narration on how he or she managed to solve the problem. In Pathfinder, regardless of who passes the skill check for you, the narration always has you as the center figure. This may be a nitpick, but this breaks the immersion and waters down the "I'm a member of a party of adventurers" feeling. There's also questing in Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous, and this aspect of the gameplay is always only as good as the quality of the writing, and in this game, it isn't great. Most quests in Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous have more stages than they need, a predictable outcome, and sensationally on-the-nose narratives. In Wintersun you come by a town in which something strange is afoot. Demons roam freely, and the townsfolk don't seem to be able to tell them apart from regular people. And when you talk to the people around the village, the only thing they seem to be able to talk about is their deity and how they worship it. I wonder if these two things are connected somehow. And as thick as the game's lore is, your critical path is generic and predictable, and as a result, most stages of the main quest are also generic and predictable. There are of course some cool quests and very interesting moments, like some of the stuff that happens at both of the laboratories that you have to visit, but if they had only kept the good stuff and ditched the rest. I thought I'd leave for last the things that I did like about Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous, and I do think there's a lot to like about it. Exploration in this game is fantastic. I really like how this is done in both of the games in this series. Locations, especially dungeons, are long and intricate, and there's a lot of areas locked behind a skill check. Sometimes there's battles, sometimes there's loot, sometimes there's even NPCs and quests to be found in non-mandatory hidden areas. Owlcat tried to make the best CRPG that has ever been made by pulling in everything they liked about other games. They didn't always get it right, but they nailed the exploration aspect of the game. I always bring up the example of Baldur's Gate 2 and Valigar Korthala when it's time to talk about exploration. You may indeed get a quest to go searching for him, but if you're simply out there exploring, you may still run into him, hear his story, and have him start one of the lengthier and most amazing side quests there are in the game. This also happens in Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous. By exploring the far confines of the world, you'll run into NPCs and even entire villages with their dark secrets. There's also some awesome level design in Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous. The Lost Chapel area, for example, has a lot of non-mandatory ground to cover. I like that the skill check to climb down this hill is greater than the one to get back up. And I like this because it forces you to venture forth into the unknown. And if you do that, you can even find caves that are off the beaten trail for you to explore. Even locations that seem to be there for specific story-related milestones have nooks and crannies to look under. Hell, there's even some exploration to be done in some of the locations in which random encounters take place. And then there's the itemization in Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous. Itemization in Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous is hands down the best I've seen in any CRPG. Items should always be an integral part of your character's build, and I find most CRPGs, some top tier ones even, to be somewhat disappointing in this regard. Most of the times, the best items in CRPGs are considered such because they have extra plus X stat or Y armor class. I recently played Solasta Crown of the Magister, and the best items in that game were made by applying X or Y recipe to a crude prime weapon. But these recipes were your typical +1 piercing damage or +1 fire damage deal. Good items in Pathfinder are plentiful, even excellent items aren't that hard to come by. But then there's a slew of named items with special effects and conditions that have immense tactical value, and those are precious hard to find. Take this belt for example. If strength is an important stat for you, and if animal companions are a big part of your tactical design, then this belt is the shit. Then there's the half of the pair pendant, which is really two parts of the same pendant. Let's read the item description for a moment. Whenever two creatures wearing different halves of this pendant are within 10 feet distance of each other, each gets a +2 circumstance bonus on attack rolls and a +2 circumstance bonus to armor class. So I had both Land and Arushale in my party. And since they always stood at a distance and almost always next to each other, I gave each one a half of this pendant, and their attack rating seemed to have gone through the roof after I did. Or these two daggers, Soft Cut and Deep Rip. Neither of them may be as good as that other dagger that you're seeing there, but Soft Cut triggers Deep Rip's ability, and that makes them work better in tandem. Deep Rip, for example, has this nice little additional perk. If this weapon deals damage against a prone or paralyzed creature first time in a round, it deals double the weapon damage, which is something to consider if you have any paralyzing spells at your disposal. Give these two weapons to Woljif and you'll see a big difference. We'll be talking about crafting later, but know that there's also the possibility to create your own potions and scrolls. This is a big thing in Pathfinder, since there's a good chance your party won't have all the talents needed to efficiently cut through every combat situation they're ever going to face. And you may run into nasty walls if you're not prepared with the appropriate scroll or potion. And I think it's very adventure-y that you can craft scrolls, brew potions, and cook meals while you're camping. And last but not least, there's Illusionera. What about Illusionera, you ask? All of it. Holy shit, this place is awesome. Let's get this out of the way though. Moving the camera perspective around to make the buildings and islands move, that was idiotic. Moving the camera is not meant to be a game mechanic, and it should have never been used as such. I get it, the concept of the shifting city is mind-blowing, but asking the player to move the camera around to get it to work? No, just no. That aside, this place condenses everything that's good about Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous, and almost none of the things that didn't work for me. Not only are enemies and combat situations more diverse and challenging than in the rest of the game, but there's even an arena a la Slayer Seeker Survivor to test your mettle. I love how one of your companion's quest ties into the main story at the arena. It even ends in an epic and uncharacteristically poignant climax. Some of the best quests are also found in Illusionera, like that side quest about the Aasimar who buys female Aasimar slaves at the slave market to free them from the slavers, or the multi-stage quest about earning Valexia's favor. For once there's some intriguing mystery to look forward to. For once quests, puzzles, and combat situations don't outstay their welcome. For once it's easy to go back and forth between the resting location and where the adventure is to be had. In Illusionera, there are also quite a few things story-wise that unfold in certain ways depending on some of your previous actions and decisions. In short, there's some proper Baldur's Gating going on here. Locations around Illusionera are interesting and the city feels alive, busy, mysterious, and straight out fascinating. Also, for this large chunk of the game, you don't have to worry about army, stronghold, or crusade management, which is a good thing. In most games, movies, and books that take place in medieval fantasy settings, or in any setting really, bad guys are presented as creatures whose only duty, mission, and purpose in life is to fuck with you and the world around you. Where do they come from?
I don't know.
Of course not.
Why are they evil?
I don't know.
Of course not.
Is there anything else they're interested in? What do they do when they're not trying to kill you? Surprisingly, the most interesting thing about Illusionera is how well it works narratively to present the demons in their own turf. Turns out that they are not so different from mortals. They have a city of their own, with taverns, sport arenas, brothels. They enjoy the same things as we do.
You enjoy brothels?
No. But it's cool. It also turns out that not all of them have an interest in mortal realms and are perfectly fine stewing in their own filth in Illusionera. There's something about Illusionera that gives it a feeling of chaotic lawlessness, not unlike the one you get from the Sigil in Planescape Torment, only with a current-gen AAA WoW factor. But at the end of the day, it's all about the fun factor. In Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous is a game of moments. There's the mission to hold the line at the tavern, the mission to take the Lost Chapel, the mission to take Dresden, and the entire act of Illusionera. But there are just too many locations in which there are just too many cut and paste combat encounters. 7 fucking ghosts? Why couldn't there be 3? There are too many puzzles, most of which are tedious, and there's way too much repetition of the irritating villain escapes in the nick of time plot device. I spent almost 1/3 of the game wishing it was over, and that's absolutely not a good thing. Story and lore. In the interest of keeping this video under the 2-hour mark, I'll just say the 4 things that did not work for me at all in Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous. Most of these things are also true of Kingmaker, though the story in that game has quite a few problems of its own. Let's break it down then. And I'm talking break. First, some of the key characters' motivations aren't strong enough, or they aren't very well explained in-game. Second, overly bloated narrative. Third, shallow lore. I'll get to that. And a complete lack of sense of idiosyncrasy. Fourth, repetitive plot devices. So let's start with character motivations. While the good guys are fighting for the preservation of their land and their people, and that is something that anyone can easily relate to, the bad guys are a different story. At first, Tuscari is presented to us as a competent, imposing, and utterly evil character, with all the mockery of the good side that you'd expect from your typical tropey medieval fantasy villain. But why do you want to conquer Golarion, Tuscari? Okay. All we are told is that Tuscari took an interest in the barbarian nation of Sarkoris because apparently the planar barrier between the world of Golarion and his planar realm was thin around these parts. And that he has a bone to pick with the good guys because he's been handed his ass on a platter in the past by one of the gods the mortals worship. But why is he interested in conquering Sarkoris or the whole of Golarion in the first place? Do mortal realms have some sort of scarce resource that is needed in the demon world? Does he resent mortals for some reason? Does he need slaves to farm resources to wage war against other demon lords like Nocticula? And what about Baphomet? At some point in the game, the demoness Nocticula sort of promises to sort of lend you aid in your fight against Tuscari, because apparently he's also bugging her in a way. See what I did there? No? Okay. In exchange for her help, Nocticula asks that you deal with Baphomet. This not at all tropey pesky demon lord has discovered that Nahindran crystals can be used to unlock mythical potential in creatures. I find it credible enough that Baphomet's goal is to use these crystals to bolster his power. I also understand why that would threaten Nocticula's power. But while Baphomet has a goal, his actions just seem hollow of purpose. To compensate this lack of purpose, he's been given bravado and arrogance. and that has been cranked up to 11 so that you really hate him. And to further fuel your hatred toward him, and also because you need a reason to enter his prison domain later on, he kidnaps someone you're supposed to care about. I didn't.
Mild spoilers coming your way. But Alex, the game isn't really about any of those characters. It's about Arilu Vorlish, about how the Worldwound came to be, and the reasons she had to make it all happen.
Yes, clever viewer who is still watching this video, despite the fact that you have already played the game in its entirety and have already decided whether you like it or not. Yes, Arilu Vorlish has indeed a goal and purpose, and even a character arc that is at least partially shaped by some of the other characters' actions, including yours as a player. As players, the game expects us to develop an attitude toward Arilu, but that didn't work for me for several reasons. First, they didn't handle very well the mystery aspect of Arilu. It fails to generate intrigue because whenever anything new is revealed about her past actions or who she is or her present agenda, there's always a more pressing matter to attend to. And while she's behind all of it in a way, every piece of information you come by about her involvement doesn't come off as an earth-shattering revelation that'll have you changing your plans. Second, the person doing all the evil is not the same as the main antagonist, but 95% of the game is about you fighting the evil. As a result, there's no increasing hostility between you and the main antagonist throughout the story, so your confrontation with her in the end just lacks the gravitas it merits, even with all the efforts the writers put into making closing the Worldwound the one big fucking deal. This is something that we've also seen in Pathfinder Kingmaker and Siege of Dragonspear, and it's written like this because I'll not get into that this time. It's just not great writing, okay? Third, our character's story is tied to Arilu's personal tragedy, but the important aspects about our connection to her are kept as a mystery until too late in the game, and I just didn't give a shit about anything at that point. Fourth, everything we know about Arilu, we know because of an information dump. We know it because we've read about it in a manuscript, or because we heard it from someone, or because she told us herself, or because we, watched it in a cinematic projection. Yes, this technology is conveniently available when it needs to be in this game. And it's not like she needs to be actively torturing people or doing terrible things all the time for us to develop an attitude toward her. John Irenicus, for example, only showed up from time to time in Baldur's Gate 2, and most of those times he just manifested in our dreams. And while I think that his kidnapping of Imoen was not particularly the strongest thing the writers could have done to kickstart the adventure in Baldur's Gate 2, everything we do in that game we do because Irenicus made us do it in a way. You could say that this is also the case with Arilu Vorlish, but it feels detached from the main threat in the story. Then there's the overly bloated narrative. Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines is one of my favorite games from the 2000s, and it's a masterclass in what I like to call lean narrative. When the game ends, you're left with the feeling that you took a deep dive into a world filled with mystery and intrigue, a world in which vampires have their own society and gather together in factions which are at odds with each other, but must nonetheless cooperate and adhere to the code of the masquerade, lest they become targets in the world of mortals. There are also other races like the werewolves, there's ancient knowledge about diablerie, high vampires and rites, there's magic, politics, moral dilemmas, you name it. But none of that comes off as a convoluted mess of unnecessarily bloated lore. Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines tells you just what you need to know. It's enough for you to know who's who and what's what. It's enough for you to know what to do next. It's enough for you to feel like there's a lot at stake. It's written in a way that is easy for the player to connect the dots, and there's also a lot of information that is readily available for those who want to know more. And all this extra lore is presented in the form of books, secondary dialogue options, and more. But in Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, it's up to you as a player to decide how much of the world, its history, and its characters you want to know about and explore. The game doesn't shove everything there is to know about its lore down your throat. But that's not how things are with Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous. Just as it happens with the gameplay, it seems as though the writers were much too fond of their story and the game's lore, but they didn't trust the player would take an interest in piecing all of it together, and they certainly didn't respect the player's capacity to connect the dots of the story. Their solution, as was the case with the gameplay, was to shove it all down your throat, whether you cared about it or not. I was not interested in the mongrel's entire background story. It had potential as a concept, but it was poorly written and I just didn't care about it. But since every tiny detail about them is stitched into the dialogue, I had no choice but to become an expert in mongrel lore. I didn't care about Targona or Lariel or Pulura's fall entire history. Couldn't they have given me the short version? Maybe offer the rest of the information as codex entries or in conversations to be had with some of those characters at a later time? So I'm in the middle of the siege to reclaim Dresden, for example, and I run into this character Janiel in Minago's improvised torture chamber, and she decides that this is the best moment for an information dump. Is it really? Like most other things in Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous, story and lore are a lot with too much, and it still somehow manages to come off as incredibly shallow, which takes us neatly along to the next issue, shallow lore. How can a game that throws so much information at you to the point of becoming hard to digest be so shallow at the same time, when a writer is only capable of looking at his or her own immediate social, historical, and geographical context for inspiration, when the ideas and mindsets depicted in their work mirror only narrow viewpoints on specific talking points that are completely devoid of universal values? You can safely predict that this game, movie, TV show, or whatever it is we're talking about, will go out with a whimper and erode into obscurity and oblivion. Mass Effect is not perfect, and it certainly isn't the deepest thing that's ever been written, but take the Quarians for example and their story with the Geth. Peel away the thin veneer of sci-fi and you'll see a clear reference to the Palestinian Jew conundrum. And it's not like they are trying to hide it. Look at the Quarians' attires. Just think for a moment about the fact that they roam the galaxy as a migrant fleet, because they were forced to leave their planet. What makes this reference work in the game is that the writers were clever not to point fingers and take sides. There are no villains here. The Quarians have their side of the story and the Geth have theirs. The game presents you with both sides of the story and you decide what to do with it. But of course, because in video games everything is sunshine and bunnies, you can end a war hundreds of years in the making by yelling, like Joker points out. There was a time in history in which Spanish missionaries found a way to regulate population growth amongst Bolivian natives through some sort of partial sterilization. It didn't make them completely sterile, because the missionaries didn't want that of course, but they kept indigenous population growth at acceptable margins. Does that sound familiar to you? Yeah, that's the genophage in Mass Effect, in case you didn't notice. What about the wall in Game of Thrones? Is it not a clear reference to Adrian's Wall? I remember reading some choose-your-own-adventure D&D books back in the late 80s, and maybe those books are to blame for the fact that I was never too impressed with the writing in Baldur's Gate series or in any other D&D game except perhaps Planescape Torment and Neverwinter Nights 2 Mask of the Betrayer. Reading these books transported me to a world different from my own. And this world was different not only because it took place in a fantasy setting. There was something old-fashioned about the language that these characters used, their reasoning, the things they took an interest in, their approach to guilt, honor, mercy. It felt nothing like the real world, but I could somehow still relate to most of it, and that was what made these books great. The story in Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous and the way it deals with stuff like guilt, marginalization, and authoritarianism reminds me way too much of my students. People who are mostly in their mid or late 20s and study a career within the branch of humanities. There's nothing wrong with people like that, of course, but if the narration and the dialogue and mindsets of most characters in the game that's meant to transport you to a medieval fantasy world sound like this crowd, then there is something utterly wrong about it. Characters in Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous often feel like modern-day 20-year-olds cosplaying as medieval fantasy characters, and that was just hilarious. Unintentionally hilarious, that is. Baldur's Gate and its many clones aren't perfect by any means, and sometimes they also feel like a product of their time. Some jokes and reasonings are a little too late 90s or early 2000s, but they are straight shooters for the most part.
But Alex, not everything has to be derivative of Baldur's Gate or The Lord of the Rings. Pathfinder is cool because it goes in its own fresh and original direction.
Are you still here, single-digit IQ strawman who keeps missing the point? Well, of course not every medieval fantasy story or franchise has to be derivative of D&D and The Lord of the Rings. In fact, that's one of the biggest problems in the genre. Everything is too derivative of either D&D or The Lord of the Rings. But if you read the last 3 books in the Witcher saga, because the first ones are not that well written, or if you play Tainted Grail Conquest, you'll see that there are quite a few medieval fantasy-inspired stories that are not at all derivative of D&D or The Lord of the Rings, but they also don't sound like they were written by a 20-year-old who's never read a single book of anything in his life. And that's exactly the feeling I get from Pathfinder.
But Alex, Solasta Crown of the Magister story is also a piece of garbage. Actually, it's loads worse than this one. At least Arilu Vorlish has an interesting character arc. At least the story is not entirely held together through plot-convenient occurrences and plot-accommodating characters.
Yes, Strawman, this is true. but Solasta Crown of the Magister also doesn't take itself too seriously, and as a result, well, neither did I. But this game feels like those Oscar Beatty films, Australia, that think they are way better than they actually are. Another problem with this game is that it has zero sense of idiosyncrasy. Like I mentioned earlier, Dragon Age Origins cared about me being a dwarf or an elf. Actually, it cared about its people and its idiosyncrasies. Dwarves live in Ozamar, mostly isolated from the rest of the world. They have an assembly that works like a congress. There are noble houses and also poor people who live in a part of the city called Dust Town. They are even referred to as dusters in a pejorative way. Those who leave Ozamar and never return are branded surfacers. Dwarves are headstrong, they tend to prefer to work as merchants, and they are often regarded as greedy. But they are also seen as resolute and extraordinarily resourceful people. Other races even turn to them for advice on how to fight the Darkspawn. The same goes for the elves or the Kunari, and most humans look similar because, well, Ferelden isn't exactly cosmopolitan like Orlais, for example. It's narrative choices like this that add a familiar sense of ethnicity, and that in turn brings a sense of belonging and immersion. And beyond a few isolated passages in which we are told, but not shown, this or that about the Kitsune or the Tieflings, this is nowhere to be found in Pathfinder games. What you do have is characters like this one, who looks as though she was on the subway because she was on her way to Madison Square Garden because she was going to a Knicks game, when her train got Shazammed into the fictitious world of Golarion. Well, at least that would explain why she sounds and looks like she's from New York, rocking the Latrell Sprewell haircut and all. Was she the only one who got Shazammed into this world? Why is Erebeth the only orc in the game, at least amongst our allies? And more importantly, what does being an orc add to her character? I couldn't tell, because I also have no idea what orcs are like in the world of Pathfinder. On a side note, every time I met her I wanted to greet her with "suck my cock," but the game wouldn't let me. So these guys are dwarves. Interesting. So what are dwarves like in this world?
I don't know.
Of course not. In Aasimar?
I don't know.
Of course not. Halflings?
I don't know.
Of course not. Gnomes?
I don't know.
Of course not. It feels as though the writers were a bit more concerned about cramming in every possible ethnicity in the game, but they didn't bother to elaborate on their histories and idiosyncrasies. But why is this? Is it because they don't know the difference between idiosyncrasy and stereotype? For some reason, the only exception to this seems to be the Tiefling race, and this is also true of Kingmaker. As bad as all of this is, the worst offender is probably the excessive use of the repetitive plot device of villain escaped in the nick of time to fight another day. God, I can't begin to tell you how much I hated this. TC even made a little list. Off the top of my head, spoilers, Wrath of the Righteous, Minago at least 2 times, 3 if you count Lost Chapel. It's actually 4 times, mate, if you allow her to escape during your second encounter with Darasad, Baylor boss in Dresden, Greybor's terrible intro. I concur. The boss in Wintersun area, he does die, but they literally cannot just let him die normally and needed to run for 1 extra scene. The entire dragon hunting sequence is a 3 or 4-parter. The best part is that they literally do it 1 last time for the drama. Voitiel, Woljev's companion quest. I didn't even remember this one, but okay. And there's a bunch more he didn't mention. Savamelek in Lan's quest, who escapes just as you're about to kick his ass in Illusionera. The Echo of the Skari in Illusionera. Senedra at Xanthier Vang's lab, who jumps off as soon as the angels show up. You meet her again later at the Temple of Erastil, and even there she escapes to the 2nd floor. I was laughing out loud at this point, by the way. Didn't anyone notice this when they were making the game? Because the other hypothesis would be that they did notice, but were completely okay with it. And that's even worse. Story and lore in Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous is just much too bloated, tonally off, and its peoples and places are almost completely devoid of any sense of belonging. And as it happened with the gameplay, I just couldn't see the end of it soon enough. Companions lore-wise. As it happens with the rest of the writing in Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous, there is an almost offensive modern-day 20-year-old-ish vibe to your companions. Someone in the comment section said they fell kinda flat. I wish that had been the case for me. I thought they were far worse than flat. Many of them were straight out irritating, and almost all of them were sickeningly one-dimensional. Nenya was one of the worst offenders for me. She was all about science and experiments. And I do mean every fucking thing she said had to do with that. She had no other interests or topics to talk about. Greybor? He has a ton of dialogue lines, but I'll give you a summary that covers 95% of what he's about. I'm a professional assassin, and my reputation is important to me. That's it. That's his whole freaking deal. He had a daughter which he abandoned at some point, and that could have been an interesting thread to pull, beyond the few times it's mentioned at camp and inconsequential party banter, but the game is like, nah, ain't nobody got time for that. Lan is supposed to be a lawful good character. Are you kidding me? This is one of the most chaotic characters in the game. Even in the final resolution of his last quest, he keeps his plan from you because he doesn't want to take the risk of you, his commander, ordering him not to do it. The game occasionally remembers he's lawful and has him suggest something lawful during some conversations with other NPCs to remind you of that. So, because Reddit is known for being the source of mature, relevant, and level-headed discussion, I rifled through some of the game's threads there. And much to my shocking dismay, it turns out that some of you are actually very fond of Rurushale.
You shitting me?
This is a demoness who did terrible things, and now struggles with her demonic nature as she tries to redeem herself. And this is a good case for a character, but the way she goes on about this feels like it came straight out of a Mexican soap opera. It's melodramatic, childish, and hollow, and if you engage her romantically, extraordinarily cheesy. But I did so because who doesn't want to have sex with a demoness? But everything from the exaggeratedly innocent look on her face, to the excessive self-pity and waving of guilt, to the way in which she spills her guts almost immediately about who she was and how she intends to redeem herself, is sickeningly on the nose and cheesy. Yes, she has a character arc, I suppose, but I still wanted to punch her on the face several times. Compare this to the way in which guilt is handled in the story of the elderly archer or the scientist in Tainted Grail Conquest. No, wait, actually don't. I'll do that for you in the future. And some of you also seem to like Regil? Why? He is one of the worst of the lot. Regil is supposed to be a tactical mastermind, someone who puts reason and goals above everything else, and yet, every time he gets the chance, he takes actions that lead to early victories, but that would absolutely compromise the long-term stability of his command and his allies' trust in any remotely realistic situation. Then you have elven female Jesus tagging along for the ride, also known as Ember. And because of course the game doesn't know subtlety from a beggar's ass, and is constantly connecting the dots for you, she's always talking about how sad she feels about evil souls and the pain they must be suffering. We get it, man, she always sees the good in people even when it's invisible to everyone else. And yet, this is actually one of the good companions. She may be irritating and a little bit one-dimensional at times, but they nailed the mystery aspect of this character. For once in this game we get the feeling that there's more to a character than meets the eye. Where does Ember come from? She looks and talks like a young girl, but she has memories of events that took place way before we even existed. How old is she? She's obviously tremendously powerful too, but where does her power come from? The best part about Ember's character arc is that we're never given the answers to these questions, and we don't really need to know these answers. In fact, it's this mystery what makes Ember work as a character. She more or less starts her journey as the local barefoot lunatic talking nonsense at the town square, but people eventually start listening to her and following her advice. Although it's more like they are following their own interpretation of what Ember says and turning it into advice. Whatever it is, it seems to be working for the townsfolk, so they eventually grow a cult around Ember and start worshipping her as though she were some sort of deity. I like how Ember cringes and almost facepalms herself when she learns that her followers turned her into some sort of messiah. I just wished her speech had gone beyond the generic, always do good advice. Because even demons start second-guessing their own evil intentions when they hear her words, and unless there's also some sort of magic at work, I really can't understand why. I like that she also has an impact on very important people in the story, such as Nocticula. At one point in the game, while you're out there with Ember helping her sway crusaders, cultists, and even demons over to the good side, Nocticula shows up. She explains that she was curious about the effect that Ember seemed to be having on demonkind. But her explanation comes off as a cheap excuse to cover up for the fact that she was actually beginning to care about the only person who had shown uninterested sympathy toward her as a person. Ember sees right through this and happily explains to you once Nocticula is gone and the fight is over, that she knows that her words had an effect on the demoness, and that she was destined to become a Redeemer Queen to her, people? I like how the game lets this mystery linger until the final succession of stills. For me, it was one of the few things that had a proper satisfying payoff in the end. There are also some decent characters like Darren, who runs loose with morals and rules and is fond of sexual and alcoholic debauchery, but is ultimately a good person. And then there's Woljif. Woljif reminds me way too much of some of the 20-year-olds I deal with on a daily basis. His character is completely disruptive in tone, but is also pretty decent and multidimensional. He's a tiefling, and for once, the game has a fair bit to say about that. But he's also a street kid, a member of the Thieflings. No, I didn't come up with that joke myself, that's in the game. The players also offered a fair bit of insight on his character, insight that explains why, for example, he's always excusing himself and blaming others. Woljif is probably the only character who made me roll my eyes as many times as he put a smile on my face. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said of companions as a whole, and I found myself cringing and being irritated by my companions far more often than I found myself enjoying their presence. If I have one good thing to say about companions in Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous, I'd say it's interesting that they intervene quite frequently in conversations with NPCs. I can only imagine that I missed out on a truckload of dialogue lines from those companions I didn't take with me. Not that it bothers me, as I was cringing at 90% of what they did have to say. Companions gameplay-wise. As tactical assets who tag along for the ride, these guys and gals are phenomenal. Companions are unique in what they do, but also flexible. You can have them auto-level, or you can hone them to the role you expect them to perform in your party, and it all works like charm. You have tanks of various types, you have all manners and shapes of DPS specialists, healers, and even jacks of all trades like Ember. And if you think they're not enough, you can always talk to healer and create whomever you think is missing, but I really don't see why anyone would do this. Your companions also have all sorts of skills that come in handy when camping and crafting. All it takes is to decide who's going to do what. And as simple as that sounds, this made the camping experience feel like a collaborative adventure party experience. I think that whether or not you like how mythical paths work versus your standard class progression, whether or not you think the former eclipses the latter, rendering it trivial, that's an entirely different discussion. But, as tactical tools, I think they're impeccable. Secondary mechanics and user experience. There are many sides to the user experience story in my opinion. Army management mechanics, I'm talking about recruiting troops, assigning generals, and distributing units, has some serious issues. The game offers many tooltips, but many more are missing. Some are easy to miss, and many mechanics are not intuitive at all. The user experience for puzzles is hideous for the reasons we already explained. Tiles are hard to put into place. Many of the icons in these tiles look similar, they are too complex, and therefore they are difficult to tell apart when they are in your inventory. It's also way too easy to miss that there's a limited supply of some ingredients that you use for the most mundane tasks, and that may result in you running out of ingredients to cook your preferred meal and missing out on their blessings by the end of the game. Also, my main character was a paladin, and I also had Sela in my party, and we both had horses. And not only were they hard to monitor, because the party bar is meant to display only 6 characters at any given time, but they were also impossible to tell apart, because although one was black and the other one was brown, their portraits looked exactly the same, and their names didn't appear when I hovered my cursor over their portraits. And that was pretty tiring given the huge amount of micromanagement you have to do with this game. There's also trading in Pathfinder, and it was refreshing after playing so many games that have gotten this utterly wrong to see a game getting it mostly right. I like that you can actually switch characters while you're at the inventory management screen or the trading interface, and that helps you compare the items that you're purchasing to your companion's currently equipped gear. The inventory screen has a few issues though, and all of them were also present in Pathfinder Kingmaker. For example, every time I went to the inventory screen, it would automatically scroll all the way down, so I had to scroll back up a little before I could start browsing my inventory. This isn't a serious issue, but it's a tiny bit annoying. And also, both in Kingmaker and in Wrath of the Righteous, because your character talent skills are insufficient to get your party through every combat encounter efficiently, and because you're going to need buffs that your companions just aren't capable of, or because they have a limited number of uses for each spell, you are going to be walking about with hundreds, and I do mean hundreds of potions, scrolls, and wands. And many of these bottles and scrolls look almost exactly the same. And though you have several different sorting criteria to sort your items by, they just aren't enough. So the user experience is still bad when it comes to browsing your items. I ask you this, what if you had a way to toggle your inventory to make it look like the vendor stock? What if you had a text filter with the operator contains that allowed you, for example, to write restore and dynamically filter the view to the items that contain restore to get those damn restoration bottles? Wouldn't that have been grand?
But Alex, what about console?
Fuck those guys. In addition to the gazillion aspects of its core gameplay, there's camping in Pathfinder. And it's pretty awesome compared to some other games. I'm looking at you, Solasta. It's simple, intuitive, fun, useful, and sometimes there's even some party banter that's actually worth listening to. It's still not as good as it is in games like Encased or Expeditions Viking, but it's pretty good. As a whole, I think that secondary mechanics are mostly fun and useful, and with the exception of some obscure army management and puzzle solving mechanics, user experience is mostly decent. Music. It seems like some of you went on a mad rage when I said that I thought music in Divinity Original Sin 2 was less than epically awesome. And I think that this is a good time to explain a little further what I meant at that time, because I think Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous has a few of the same issues. Soundtracks aren't easy to make. The composition has to be good, it has to be well mixed, it has to be consistent with the rest of the art package, and in my opinion, you have to not overdo it. Divinity Original Sin 2 is a very musical game. Heck, you even choose your leading instrument when you're creating your character, and the composers took the time to create different versions for many of the tracks, one for each leading instrument. That's quite impressive, isn't it? This is the tavern track in Divinity Original Sin 2. This is the tavern track in Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous.
Our path leads on. I will guide us.
They're awesome, right? Except it feels a little bit like Bardcore on tour, just for tonight, at your local trophy-named tavern. It's a little bit too polished, too well-produced, too professional, band on tour-like. I mean, don't get me wrong, I think it's awesome, just a little bit immersion-breaking. And this is the track for the fight against Discari. It's awesome, but it sounds like it wouldn't be out of place in a Blind Guardian album. I was almost expecting a blistering guitar solo to kick in at any moment. Don't you think electric guitars are a tad too much? I know that I said a nice little electric guitar touch every now and then did it for me in Desperados 3, but from the get-go that game is like, hey man, we're all down with this western thing, you know, but we're going to be doing some pretty over-the-top shit here. Are you up for it? And I was like, well yeah, I'm game. I think music in Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous is pretty good, but it often defeats its own purpose by being, well, a lot with too much. Sound effects and mix.
Let us press on.
One thing that I usually don't mind if it's overdone and over the top is sound effects. And sound effects in Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous are awesome. Combat sounds are intense and weighty, and there's almost everything from bows tensing and arrows flying to earth-shattering lightning, and this also applies to tactical combat with your army. Some of the sounds here are actually
amazing.
Scoring a crit with your archer and wiping an entire unit. Oh, the satisfaction. I also like the sonic landscape in the rest of the game and how it adds to whatever is happening, be it a thunderstorm or a bloodstorm or just the rumor you'd expect to find around a city. As for the mix, it doesn't exactly work out of the box, but you have enough options to make it work at the options panel. Overall, it's pretty freaking good. Voice acting.
Psst, look Chief, I got something to show you. Ta-da! A real beaut, isn't it? Oh, that cuts me deep, Chief. You and I saw who the traitor was. It's just that when we robbed the shop, I went in first and took what I wanted. Nothing wrong with that.
I know you came down from heaven and even stooped to a conversation with that flighty killer Nocticula, the Crusader goddess, and the lady in shadow. So that is how far you are willing to go to be rid of me.
I think the writing is so rough, so tropey, and so on the nose that it kinda drips into the voice acting. But even if we don't take that into consideration, it's all over the place. Some good characters have mediocre voice acting, and some bad characters are pretty awesomely voiced. Key characters like Arielu or Nocticula are tone consistent and credible, and voice acting in these characters is competent. And then there's something that really worked for me in Pathfinder. Zar from Shadow's Awakening, for example, was a pretty awesome character with decent voice acting, but he was meant to be an anthropomorphic wolf-like creature, and he sounded just like a regular human. In Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous, voices like the Scaris got that little extra production touch that monster-like voices should always get, in my opinion. As for this guy here, I still don't rightly know if I liked him or hated him. I thought he was often disruptive of the fantasy vibe, but man, oh man, this voice actor earned every penny they paid him for his voice acting here. This dude's one chaotic maelstrom of emotions, and the voice actor is right on top of it at all times. Really, one of the best voice acting I've heard in years. Again, if you don't factor in the actual quality of his lines. There are some stinkers here and there and some pretty bland performances, and it also grinds my gear that it's not fully voiced. But overall, voices are good enough that they made me wish it had been entirely voiced. Graphics. This is probably the biggest improvement over Kingmaker. Locations are way more complex and polished, and enemies, items, and character models have been significantly improved this time around, especially demons. Man, these things are badass. I was especially impressed with the art and layout of these screens. The graphic aspect of the game's hub is also very polished and tonally consistent, but again, the real MVP is the City of Illusionera. It was a tour de force of awesome, colorful architecture, moving parts, and mysterious floating towers. The slave market was crowded, alive, busy, terrifying, filled with twisted creatures and imposing guards. The bar was chaotic and filthy, and it truly felt like a place in which you could get stabbed in the back at any moment. It had the same vibe as the Trader's Gate Tavern in Planescape Torment, only with far better graphics and more detail. The brothel was not a place I'd like to spend time at, but I can't deny it was on point as a location. And just walking the streets was plain awesome, and it would have been even better if the game hadn't forced me to mess around with a camera perspective like an idiot. And I can end this section without talking about these cute little fellas. 10 out of 10, dude. Oh no, wait, you can't pet them? You can't pet them.
0 out of 10.
Nah, just kidding. Graphics in Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous were awesome. Performance and stability. I've heard a few people complaining about some bugs and glitches and some performance issues here and there. And to these people I say, you definitely didn't play Pathfinder Kingmaker when it first came out. Now that was a clusterfuck of bugs. Performance here has been much improved compared to the original game, and Owlcat constantly produces patches to sort things out, and that speaks volumes of them as a company. I won't ever buy another game from them again, but they've decent work ethic. At least as far as customer experience goes, that is. There are issues, yes. At first, my character kept floating about after I dismounted. Greyboar's final quest was buggy as hell, and he ended up losing all the gear I had equipped on him. Animal companions kept losing their gear. Sometimes characters remained knocked on their asses even after they've been revived and decursed. Sometimes there were unrevivable characters and I had to restart to sort that out. But for a game that's more than 180 hours long, and given the number of bugs, glitches, and performance issues its predecessor had, I'd say Wrath of the Righteous is at least decent. Oh, and loading screens have been much improved. Other considerations and final thoughts, part 2. This is a page from a lead generation guide produced by Marquito, a marketing automation service provider. In it, they talk about the thens and nows in lead generation practices, though I think they apply to many other aspects of brand management. Check out the mission. Then, represent the company. Now, represent the customer. I think that, as a game, Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous is 100% an example of the then. It thinks too highly of its gameplay and writing and too lowly of its users. It grabs its users by the wrist and it forces them to engage in every aspect of its gameplay. Yeah, it provides tools like Crusade auto-manage and makes puzzles not mandatory, but it also punishes players at the end of the game for sidestepping those things they didn't want to engage in. It crams large chunks of lore in every dialogue and narration because they didn't want to give the player the choice of exploring the story at their leisure and convenience, and because they thought the players would be too dumb to connect the dots of the story all by themselves. They made characters one-dimensional and on the nose because they didn't want to risk the players not getting what they were about. Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous is too ambitious for its own good. It brings in themes from Planescape Torment and tries to juggle with them without fully understanding them, it seems. It brings some ideas from Dragon Age Origins, like that, in the meantime, those friends you didn't take with you held the line at the gates. But some of those ideas felt crammed into situations they didn't quite belong in, and some others felt like an afterthought. It brought the lengthy dungeons, the resource management that naturally comes with it, and the attrition factor from the Icewind Dale series, and the incursion into realms of evil that we've seen in games like Baldur's Gate 2 and Mask of the Betrayer. And they threw in every gameplay aspect they could think of. And to make it more epic than anything that's ever been made before, developers and writers went about it the Kylo Ren way. That's enough. And sometimes, well, more is less. If you like this brief summary of my opinion on the game, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't, thank you for watching all the way up until now. Today more than ever. If you like what you're seeing in this channel, please consider subscribing and clicking that notification bell to avoid the usual YouTube shenanigans. Share the video, but most importantly, never stop gaming, but don't let gaming get in the way of your hopes and dreams. Bye everyone.